Sarah stared at her phone screen, watching her ex-boyfriend's Instagram story for the third time that evening. Marcus was at another party, arm draped around another woman, that familiar smirk playing across his lips. The same one that had once made her heart race and now made her stomach turn. She told herself she was checking to confirm what a terrible person he was, to validate her decision to leave. But deep down, in a place she refused to acknowledge, she felt something else entirely. A twisted form of admiration for his complete lack of concern for anyone's feelings, including hers. "I hate him," she whispered to her empty apartment, but the words felt hollow. If she truly hated him, why couldn't she stop watching? Why did she find herself scrolling through dating apps, unconsciously swiping right on men with that same dangerous edge, that same emotional unavailability that had destroyed her for 2 years? Sarah worked as a social worker in downtown Chicago, dedicating her life to helping others heal from trauma. She prided herself on being empathetic, nurturing, selfless. Yet here she was, magnetically drawn to someone who embodied everything she claimed to stand against. This contradiction would have fascinated Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who spent his life exploring the hidden chambers of the human psyche. Jung understood that we are not the unified, coherent beings we pretend to be. Instead, we are walking contradictions, houses divided against themselves, carrying within us both the saint and the sinner, the healer and the destroyer. What we consciously reject, our unconscious often secretly craves. What we publicly condemn, we privately admire. This is the fundamental paradox of human nature that Jung called the shadow. In the fluorescent-lit break room of the community center where Sarah worked, her colleague Jennifer was venting about her own relationship struggles. "I don't understand why I keep attracting these narcissistic guys," Jennifer complained, stirring sugar into her coffee with more force than necessary. "I'm a good person. I volunteer. I care about people. I'm nothing like them." Sarah nodded sympathetically, but Jung would have seen something different in this conversation. He would have recognized the unconscious confession hidden within Jennifer's frustration, the secret part of her that envied those narcissistic men their complete self-focus, their ability to put themselves first without guilt or apology. The shadow, according to Jung, is not simply the bad parts of ourselves that we've rejected. It's far more complex and disturbing than that. The shadow contains all the aspects of our personality that we've deemed unacceptable, not just the obviously negative traits like cruelty or selfishness, but also qualities that might actually serve us well. Assertiveness, healthy selfishness, the ability to say no, the capacity to prioritize our own needs. In a culture that often rewards people-pleasing and self-sacrifice, especially in women, these necessary survival skills get pushed into the darkness of the unconscious mind. Sarah's attraction to Marcus wasn't just masochistic self-destruction. It was her shadow's desperate attempt to reclaim the parts of herself she had abandoned in her quest to be good. Marcus represented everything she had been taught to suppress, the ability to be selfish, to take what he wanted without apology, to exist in the world without constantly worrying about everyone else's feelings. Her conscious mind was horrified by these traits, but her unconscious mind was secretly fascinated by them. This is why toxic people can feel so magnetically attractive. They embody the forbidden aspects of ourselves that we've banished to the shadow. The American culture, with its emphasis on individual success while simultaneously demanding conformity to social norms, creates particularly fertile ground for shadow projection. We're told to be ambitious but not greedy, confident but not arrogant, strong but not aggressive. These impossible standards force us to split ourselves in half, presenting an acceptable face to the world while burying our more complex, contradictory nature in the unconscious. The result is a culture full of people who are secretly drawn to those who embody what they've rejected in themselves. Jung observed that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. When Sarah felt that familiar mix of revulsion and fascination watching Marcus's social media, she was actually encountering her own rejected self. The intensity of her reaction, the fact that she couldn't simply dismiss him as irrelevant, revealed the presence of her own shadow material. We are never neutral about the traits we've disowned. We either idealize them in others or demonize them, but we cannot ignore them. This psychological dynamic plays out not just in romantic relationships, but in all areas of American life. We're simultaneously attracted to and repelled by the wealthy elite who flaunt their excess, the politicians who say exactly what they think without filter, the celebrities who live without apparent consequence for their actions. Part of us condemns them, but another part, the shadow part, secretly admires their freedom from the constraints that bind us. They represent the unleashed version of ourselves that we've learned to fear and suppress. The tragedy is that by rejecting these aspects of ourselves so completely, we become vulnerable to being manipulated by those who embody them. Sarah's inability to access her own healthy selfishness made her easy prey for Marcus's exploitation. Her shadow's hunger for what she'd rejected made her blind to the genuine toxicity in his behavior. She couldn't distinguish between healthy assertiveness and destructive narcissism because she'd banished both to the same dark corner of her psyche. This is how the shadow keeps us trapped in cycles of attraction to the very people who will hurt us most. Dr. Michael Chen sat in his pristine office overlooking Lake Michigan, reviewing patient files with the same meticulous attention to detail that had made him one of Chicago's most respected psychiatrists. His colleagues saw him as the embodiment of professional success, calm, rational, always in control. But as he read about his patient David, a charismatic con artist who had manipulated dozens of victims, Michael felt something uncomfortable stirring in his chest. It wasn't just clinical interest. There was something else, something he couldn't quite name, that made him look forward to their sessions with an intensity that troubled him. David was everything Michael had trained himself not to be. Where Michael was careful and measured, David was impulsive and reckless. Where Michael agonized over every decision, considering all possible consequences, David acted on pure instinct, taking what he wanted without hesitation. During their sessions, David would lean back in his chair with an easy confidence that Michael envied, describing his latest schemes with an almost artistic pride. "You know what your problem is, Doc?" David had said during their last session, his eyes gleaming with amusement. "You think too much. You've forgotten how to just take what you want." The comment had haunted Michael for days. He found himself thinking about it during his morning jog along the lakefront, during his carefully planned meals, during his evening meditation practice. Everything in his life was structured, controlled, optimized for maximum benefit and minimum risk. He had built his entire identity around being the opposite of men like David. Yet something in David's words had struck a nerve, awakening a part of himself that he had buried so deeply he had almost forgotten it existed. Jung would have recognized Michael's fascination as a classic case of shadow projection. The shadow doesn't just contain our rejected negative traits, it also holds the positive qualities we've suppressed in our quest to fit into society's expectations. Michael had spent his entire life learning to be appropriate, to follow rules, to consider others' needs before his own. In the process, he had also buried his spontaneity, his ability to take risks, his capacity for bold action. These weren't inherently negative traits, but in his family and professional culture, they had been deemed dangerous and unacceptable. Growing up as the son of Chinese immigrants in suburban Detroit, Michael had learned early that success meant perfect behavior, flawless grades, and never causing trouble. His parents had sacrificed everything to give him opportunities they never had, and he felt the weight of their expectations like a physical presence. When his younger brother Kevin had rebelled in high school, getting arrested for vandalism, dropping out of college to pursue music, Michael had watched his parents' heartbreak and vowed never to cause them such pain. He became the perfect son, the model student, the ideal professional. But in doing so, he had also become a stranger to his own desires and impulses. The American dream, as Michael had internalized it, required the complete suppression of anything that might jeopardize success and respectability. Risk-taking, rebellion, even healthy selfishness were luxuries he couldn't afford. He had to be twice as good, twice as careful, twice as controlled as his white colleagues to achieve the same recognition. This cultural pressure had shaped not just his behavior, but his very sense of self. He had learned to see spontaneity as recklessness, assertiveness as aggression, self-advocacy as selfishness. But the shadow has a way of demanding attention. The more completely we reject certain aspects of ourselves, the more powerfully they call to us from the darkness. Michael's fascination with David wasn't pathological. It was his psyche's attempt to reconnect with the parts of himself he had amputated in his quest for acceptability. David represented not just the criminal Michael would never become, but also the free, spontaneous, unapologetically self-interested man Michael had never allowed himself to be. This dynamic is particularly pronounced in American culture, where the mythology of individual freedom coexists with intense pressure to conform to social and professional expectations. We're told we can be anything we want, while simultaneously being given very narrow definitions of what constitutes success and acceptability. The result is a culture full of people who have split themselves in half, presenting an acceptable persona to the world while their authentic selves languish in the shadow. Jung called this acceptable face we present to the world the persona, the mask we wear to navigate social expectations. The persona isn't inherently bad. We all need some degree of social adaptation to function in society. But problems arise when the persona becomes so rigid and complete that we lose touch with our authentic selves entirely. We become what Jung called persona identified, so fused with our social role that we forget who we are underneath the mask. Michael's attraction to David was his shadow's rebellion against this persona identification. Somewhere deep in his unconscious, a part of him was screaming for recognition, demanding to be acknowledged and integrated. This wasn't a sign of moral weakness or hidden criminality. It was a sign of psychological health. His psyche was trying to restore balance, to reclaim the vitality and authenticity he had sacrificed for social acceptance. The tragedy is that without conscious awareness of this dynamic, Michael remained vulnerable to being manipulated by people like David. His unconscious hunger for what he'd rejected made him blind to genuine red flags, just as Sarah's suppressed selfishness had made her vulnerable to Marcus's exploitation. When we don't own our shadow consciously, it owns us unconsciously, driving us toward people and situations that promise to fulfill our rejected needs while often delivering only pain and disappointment. Jung understood that the goal isn't to become like the toxic people we're drawn to, but to reclaim the healthy aspects of what they represent. Michael didn't need to become a con artist to access his spontaneity and boldness, but he did need to acknowledge and integrate these qualities in healthy ways, or he would remain forever split against himself, secretly envying those who embodied what he'd rejected, while consciously condemning them for their destructiveness. The rain drummed against the windows of the upscale bar in downtown Manhattan as Elena Martinez nursed her third glass of wine, watching her date across the table with a mixture of fascination and unease. James was everything she usually avoided: arrogant, dismissive of others, completely self-absorbed. He had spent the last hour talking about his latest business acquisition, barely asking her a single question about herself. Any rational person would have excused themselves by now, but Elena found herself leaning in closer, hanging on his every word. "The thing about most people," James was saying, gesturing with his whiskey glass, "is they're too weak to take what they really want. They make excuses, they worry about what others think, they play it safe. That's why they stay mediocre." His eyes met hers with an intensity that made her stomach flutter. "You're different, though. I can see it in you, that hunger for something more." Elena felt a thrill run through her, even as her rational mind recoiled at his casual cruelty toward others. She was a nonprofit lawyer who had dedicated her career to fighting for the underdog. Yet something about James's complete lack of empathy was intoxicating. This wasn't Elena's first encounter with this type of man. Her relationship history read like a catalog of charming narcissists, emotional manipulators, and commitment-phobic players. Her friends had stopped trying to understand it. "You're such a good person," her best friend Maria had said just last week. "Why do you always fall for these assholes?" Elena had laughed it off, but the question haunted her. She genuinely cared about justice, equality, helping others. So why was she magnetically drawn to men who embodied the opposite of everything she claimed to value? Jung would have understood Elena's pattern as a classic example of what he called enantiodromia, the tendency of the psyche to swing toward its opposite when one side becomes too dominant. Elena had built her entire identity around being good, selfless, morally superior. She worked 60-hour weeks fighting for causes she believed in, donated a significant portion of her salary to charity, and volunteered at a homeless shelter on weekends. Her conscious mind was completely identified with virtue and altruism. But the shadow doesn't disappear just because we ignore it. The more completely Elena identified with being good, the more her unconscious craved experiences of being bad. James represented everything she had rejected in herself. The ability to be selfish, to prioritize her own needs, to take what she wanted without guilt or apology. Her attraction to him wasn't just romantic. It was her shadow's desperate attempt to experience the forbidden aspects of human nature that she had banished from her conscious identity. The American cultural context made this dynamic even more pronounced. Elena had grown up in a traditional Mexican-American family where women were expected to be nurturing, self-sacrificing, and always putting others first. Her mother had worked 2 jobs while raising 4 children, never complaining, never asking for anything for herself. Elena had internalized these values deeply, but she had also unconsciously resented them. Part of her envied men like James, their complete freedom from these expectations, their ability to exist in the world without constantly worrying about everyone else's needs. This cultural programming had created what Jung might have called a split persona, a conscious identity so rigidly good that it had to repress enormous amounts of natural human selfishness and aggression. Elena couldn't even admit to herself that she sometimes resented her clients' neediness, that she occasionally fantasized about quitting her job and doing something purely for money, that she sometimes felt superior to the people she helped. These thoughts were too threatening to her self-image, so they got pushed into the shadow where they festered and grew. James's complete lack of guilt about his selfishness was like a drug to Elena's repressed shadow. When he talked about manipulating business deals to his advantage, part of her was horrified, but another part was secretly thrilled. When he dismissed other people as weak or pathetic, her conscious mind recoiled, but her shadow whispered, Finally, someone who says what we're all thinking. This wasn't because Elena was secretly a bad person. It was because she was a complete person who had been forced to reject half of her humanity. The seductive power of toxic people often lies not in their obvious destructiveness, but in their embodiment of the forbidden aspects of human nature that we've all had to suppress. They represent a kind of psychological freedom that feels both terrifying and irresistible to those of us who have learned to cage our darker impulses. James didn't just offer Elena romance. He offered her vicarious access to a way of being in the world that she had never allowed herself to explore. This dynamic is particularly powerful in a culture like America's, which simultaneously celebrates individual freedom while demanding strict adherence to social and moral codes. We're told we can be anything we want while being given very narrow definitions of what constitutes a good person. The result is a society full of people who are secretly fascinated by those who break the rules they've learned to follow so religiously. Jung observed that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. Elena's attraction to James wasn't just about him. It was about the chemical reaction between her repressed shadow and his embodied darkness. He represented the parts of herself she had never been allowed to explore, and being near him gave her a taste of what it might feel like to live without the constant weight of moral obligation and self-sacrifice. But this kind of shadow projection is inherently unstable and ultimately destructive. Because Elena wasn't consciously owning her own capacity for selfishness and aggression, she couldn't distinguish between healthy self-advocacy and toxic narcissism. Her hunger for what she'd rejected made her vulnerable to exploitation by those who had no healthy boundaries around these traits. She was drawn to the darkness in James without understanding that what she really needed was to integrate her own shadow in healthy, conscious ways. The tragedy of this pattern is that it keeps us trapped in cycles of attraction to people who promise to fulfill our rejected needs while actually preventing us from ever integrating these aspects of ourselves. Elena would never learn to be appropriately selfish or assertive as long as she was getting these needs met vicariously through relationships with toxic men. Her shadow would remain forever hungry, forever seeking completion through others who could never truly satisfy what could only be healed from within. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the corporate conference room as David Kim stared across the table at his new business partner, Victoria Sterling. She was everything he had been taught to despise. Ruthlessly ambitious, willing to cut corners, completely unconcerned with the collateral damage her decisions might cause to their employees. Yet, as she outlined her plan to acquire their struggling competitor through what amounted to legal but ethically questionable means, David felt a familiar thrill of excitement that he couldn't quite suppress. "The beauty of this approach," Victoria was saying, her manicured fingers dancing across the contract, "is that we can gut their workforce, absorb their best assets, and eliminate the competition all in one move. Sure, 300 people will lose their jobs, but that's not our problem. Business is war, David. The sooner you accept that, the more successful you'll become." Her smile was sharp as a blade, and David found himself nodding along despite every moral instinct screaming in protest. David had built his career on being the ethical businessman, the guy who treated employees fairly, who considered the social impact of his decisions, who believed that success didn't have to come at others' expense. His company had been featured in magazines as a model of conscious capitalism. He donated generously to charity, served on nonprofit boards, and genuinely believed in doing good while doing well. So why was he finding Victoria's predatory approach so compelling? Why did her complete lack of conscience feel less like a character flaw and more like a superpower he secretly wished he possessed? This internal conflict would have fascinated Jung, who understood that our conscious values often exist in direct opposition to our unconscious desires. David's attraction to Victoria's ruthlessness wasn't a sign of moral corruption. It was his shadow's rebellion against the impossible standards he had set for himself. In trying to be perfectly ethical in a system that often rewards the opposite, David had created an internal pressure cooker that was now seeking release through his fascination with someone who embodied everything he had rejected. The American business culture had taught David to split himself in half. On one side was the conscious persona of the ethical leader, the man who cared about stakeholders and social responsibility. On the other side was the shadow containing all the natural human drives for dominance, competition, and self-interest that capitalism actually requires for success. This split had made him successful in terms of public image, but it had also made him vulnerable to being seduced by those who had integrated these darker qualities without any moral constraints. Victoria represented what Jung might have called the negative anima, the destructive feminine archetype that embodies seduction, manipulation, and the promise of power through moral compromise. She wasn't just offering David a business partnership. She was offering him access to the parts of himself he had disowned in his quest to be good. Her complete comfort with her own selfishness and aggression was intoxicating to someone who had spent years suppressing these natural human traits. The unconscious conspiracy that Jung identified works like this. When we reject certain aspects of ourselves too completely, we become magnetically attracted to others who embody these traits. We tell ourselves we're horrified by their behavior, but unconsciously, we're fascinated by their freedom from the constraints that bind us. This creates a psychological dependency where we need these toxic people to experience the fullness of human nature that we've denied ourselves. David's employees had always praised him for his fairness and consideration, but lately he had begun to resent their neediness, their constant requests for accommodation and understanding. Part of him envied Victoria's ability to simply say no, to prioritize profit over people without guilt or apology. When she talked about weak employees who couldn't handle the demands of business, his conscious mind recoiled, but his shadow whispered agreement. This wasn't because David was secretly a sociopath. It was because he was a complete human being who had been forced to reject normal competitive and self-interested impulses. The American dream itself is built on this kind of psychological splitting. We're told to be compassionate and caring while also being told to compete and win at all costs. We're supposed to be team players while also being individual achievers. We're expected to be humble while also being confident enough to succeed. These contradictory demands force us to develop what Jung called a false persona, a socially acceptable mask that hides our more complex and contradictory nature. Victoria's appeal lay not just in her business acumen, but in her psychological integration. She had no internal conflict about her selfishness because she had never tried to be anything else. While David was constantly monitoring himself for signs of moral failure, Victoria was free to focus entirely on results. This freedom was intoxicating to someone who had spent years in internal conflict between his natural competitive instincts and his moral ideals. Jung understood that this kind of shadow projection creates what he called participation mystique, a psychological merger where we lose our individual boundaries and become unconsciously identified with the other person. David wasn't just attracted to Victoria, he was beginning to see the world through her eyes, to adopt her values and perspectives as his own. This wasn't conscious choice. It was unconscious compensation for his own psychological imbalance. The danger of this dynamic is that it prevents genuine integration of the shadow. Instead of consciously owning his own capacity for selfishness and aggression in healthy ways, David was experiencing these traits vicariously through Victoria. This kept him dependent on her for access to parts of himself, while also making him vulnerable to her manipulation. She could sense his unconscious hunger for what she represented and use it to influence his decisions in ways that served her interests rather than his own. The unconscious conspiracy that Jung identified is particularly powerful in American culture because of our extreme emphasis on individual moral responsibility, combined with systemic pressures that often reward amoral behavior. We're told to be good people while operating in systems that often punish genuine goodness. This creates a culture full of people like David, consciously moral, but unconsciously hungry for the freedom that comes with moral flexibility. The only way out of this trap, according to Jung, is conscious integration of the shadow. David needed to acknowledge his own capacity for selfishness and aggression, not to become like Victoria, but to develop healthy boundaries and realistic expectations for himself. He needed to understand that being human means containing multitudes, including some that aren't particularly noble or admirable. Only by owning these aspects of himself could he free himself from the unconscious conspiracy that made him vulnerable to those who embodied what he had rejected. Dr. Sarah Chen sat in her therapist's office 6 months after her relationship with Marcus had finally ended, staring at the rain streaking down the windows as she tried to make sense of the patterns that had governed her life for so long. "I keep thinking about what you said last session," she told Dr. Williams, her voice barely above a whisper. "About how I'm not attracted to toxic people because I'm broken, but because there's something in them that I've rejected in myself. I've been trying to understand what that could possibly be." Dr. Williams, a Jungian analyst who had spent decades helping people integrate their shadows, leaned forward with the kind of gentle attention that made space for difficult truths. "What comes up for you when you think about the qualities that drew you to Marcus?" she asked. Sarah's first instinct was to recoil. She had spent months in therapy cataloging Marcus's narcissism, his emotional unavailability, his casual cruelty. But something in Dr. Williams' question invited her to look deeper, beyond the obvious toxicity to something more fundamental. "He was so confident," Sarah said slowly, the word feeling strange in her mouth. "He never doubted himself, never worried about what other people thought. He just existed in the world like he had every right to be there, to take up space, to want things for himself." As she spoke, Sarah felt a familiar ache in her chest, not the pain of missing Marcus, but something deeper. It was the grief of recognizing how completely she had abandoned her own right to exist with that kind of certainty. Growing up as the daughter of Chinese immigrants who had sacrificed everything for her success, Sarah had learned early that her needs came last. Her parents had worked multiple jobs, lived in a cramped apartment, and denied themselves every luxury so she could have opportunities they never had. The weight of their sacrifice had shaped her into someone who felt guilty for wanting anything for herself, who measured her worth by how much she could give to others, who had learned to see self-advocacy as selfishness. "I think," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger, "I think I was attracted to his selfishness because I've never allowed myself to be selfish about anything, even healthy selfishness, like knowing what I want, or setting boundaries, or saying no. I've been so afraid of being like the people who hurt my parents, the landlords who raised their rent, the bosses who exploited them, that I've become someone who can't even advocate for myself in basic ways." This was the beginning of what Jung called shadow integration, the conscious recognition and reclaiming of rejected aspects of the self. Sarah's attraction to Marcus hadn't been pathological. It had been her psyche's attempt to reconnect with the healthy assertiveness and self-advocacy she had disowned in her quest to be good. The problem wasn't that she was drawn to these qualities, but that she had never learned to embody them in healthy ways herself. Dr. Williams nodded, recognizing the breakthrough that was occurring. "What would it look like," she asked, "if you could access that confidence, that sense of having a right to exist and want things, without the toxicity that Marcus wrapped around it?" This question opened up a new possibility for Sarah. The idea that she could reclaim her shadow, not by becoming like the toxic people she was drawn to, but by integrating their positive qualities in conscious, healthy ways. Over the following months, Sarah began the difficult work of shadow integration. She started small, ordering what she actually wanted at restaurants instead of deferring to others, expressing her preferences in social situations, setting boundaries with demanding clients at work. Each act of healthy selfishness felt revolutionary, like she was reclaiming territory that had been occupied by foreign forces for decades. The process wasn't smooth or linear. Sarah's conditioning ran deep, and every act of self-advocacy triggered waves of guilt and anxiety. Her family didn't understand her changes. Her mother worried that success was making her selfish like Americans, while her father expressed concern that she was becoming too independent. But with Dr. Williams' support, Sarah learned to tolerate the discomfort of growth, to sit with the anxiety that came with expanding beyond her familiar patterns. Jung had understood that shadow integration is not about becoming the opposite of who we are, but about becoming whole. Sarah didn't need to become narcissistic like Marcus to access healthy self-regard. She didn't need to become cruel to develop appropriate boundaries. She needed to find the middle path between self-sacrifice and selfishness, between accommodation and aggression, between people-pleasing and narcissism. The transformation was subtle but profound. As Sarah learned to advocate for herself in healthy ways, her attraction to toxic men began to fade. She no longer needed to experience assertiveness vicariously through relationships with narcissists because she was developing her own capacity for healthy self-interest. The magnetic pull she had felt toward emotionally unavailable men weakened as she became more emotionally available to herself. This is the paradox of shadow work that Jung identified. The more we own our capacity for the traits we've rejected, the less we need to seek them out in others. Sarah's growing comfort with her own assertiveness made her less tolerant of genuine toxicity, not more. She could now distinguish between healthy confidence and destructive narcissism because she had developed her own relationship with these energies. The integration process also revealed positive qualities that Sarah had buried, along with the negative ones. Her natural leadership abilities, her capacity for strategic thinking, her ability to inspire others, all of these had been suppressed, along with her assertiveness, because her family and cultural conditioning had taught her that these qualities were inappropriate for someone in her position. As she reclaimed her right to take up space, these gifts began to emerge as well. Dr. Williams often reminded Sarah that shadow integration is not a destination, but a lifelong practice. The goal isn't to become perfect, she would say, but to become conscious, to know yourself fully enough that you can choose how to express these energies rather than having them choose for you. This consciousness was what had been missing from Sarah's previous relationships. The awareness that her attraction to certain types of people was revealing something important about her own disowned aspects. As Sarah's therapy progressed, she began to understand that her pattern of attraction to toxic men had been a form of unconscious healing attempt. Her psyche had been trying to restore balance, to reclaim the parts of herself that had been sacrificed to social conditioning and family expectations. The problem hadn't been the attempt itself, but the unconscious way it had played out, leading her to seek integration through relationships with people who embodied her rejected qualities in destructive rather than healthy ways. The final stage of Sarah's integration involved developing what Jung called conscious relationship, the ability to see others clearly rather than as screens for her own projections. As she became more whole within herself, she found herself attracted to partners who were also doing their own inner work, who could meet her as an equal rather than as a complement to her disowned aspects. These relationships were less dramatic than her previous ones, but they were also more real, more sustainable, and more genuinely fulfilling. Jung's promise was that by making the unconscious conscious, we free ourselves from the compulsion to repeat destructive patterns. Sarah's journey proved this promise true. By understanding and integrating her shadow, she had transformed not just her relationships, but her entire way of being in the world. She had learned to be appropriately selfish without being cruel, assertive without being aggressive, confident without being narcissistic. Most importantly, she had learned to be whole, no longer split between the good person she presented to the world and the complex, multifaceted human being she actually was. The rain had stopped by the time Sarah left Dr. Williams' office that day, and for the first time in years, she felt truly free. Not free from her responsibilities or her care for others, but free from the unconscious patterns that had kept her trapped in cycles of attraction to people who could never truly fulfill what could only be healed from within. She had found her way home to herself, and in doing so, had discovered that the person she had been seeking all along was not someone else, but the integrated, whole version of who she had always been beneath the conditioning and the fear. If you've made it this far, you've just witnessed something profound, the mirror that Jung held up to all of humanity. The uncomfortable truth is that we are not the heroes of our own stories that we pretend to be. We are complex, contradictory beings carrying both light and shadow, saint and sinner, healer and destroyer within us. Your attraction to toxic people isn't a flaw. It's your soul's desperate attempt to reclaim the parts of yourself you've abandoned in your quest to be good enough for a world that demands impossible perfection. Every narcissist you've been drawn to, every emotionally unavailable person who's captured your heart, every toxic individual you can't seem to forget, they are all mirrors reflecting back the disowned aspects of your own psyche. But here's what changes everything. Once you see this pattern, you can never unsee it. Once you understand that your external world is a reflection of your internal landscape, you hold the key to transformation. You no longer need to seek completion through others because you can find it within yourself. The path forward isn't to become like the toxic people who've hurt you. It's to consciously integrate the healthy versions of what they represent, to reclaim your right to be assertive without being cruel, confident without being narcissistic, self-interested without being selfish. This is Jung's ultimate gift to us, the understanding that our greatest wounds often point toward our greatest potential for wholeness. Your shadow isn't your enemy, it's your teacher, waiting patiently in the darkness for you to turn toward it with consciousness and compassion. The question isn't whether you have a shadow. You do. The question is whether you'll continue to let it control you from the unconscious, or whether you'll have the courage to face it, integrate it, and become the whole, authentic person you were always meant to be. What resonated most with you in this journey through the shadow? Have you recognized your own patterns in these stories? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your insights might be exactly what someone else needs to hear on their own path to integration. If this video opened your eyes to something you'd never seen before, hit that subscribe button and join our community of people committed to deep psychological transformation. We're exploring the hidden territories of the human psyche every week, uncovering the unconscious patterns that shape our lives. Thank you for having the courage to look into the mirror with me today.